Alright, so imagine this. It's 1840 and you're living in Hudson, Ohio. It's a beautiful place. Great farms, beautiful scenery. There's nothing more you could want. Now your neighbor, John Brown, was a senator for the abolitionist cause. He was a great senator at the least. Abolitionists were people that thought slavery was wrong and that it shouldn't exist. Most people in Ohio at that time were abolitionists and thought slavery was wrong. But oh boy, Mr. John Brown was on a whole different level of anti-slavery. John Brown wanted black people to be treated as equal as white people were. Now, even though people were still anti-slavery, which is good, don't get me wrong, some still didn't treat black people as equal. Later examples would be the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896, which stated that the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional as long as separate but equal facilities were provided. John Brown liked his free black neighbors. He actually had them over a lot, for dinner, to sing, and they stayed up late telling each other stories. Also, as a sign of respect, Mr. Brown made sure to call all of the free black men he talked to by their last name. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Better History, and more importantly, another season. This season will be specifically about the Civil War and its causes. Today is part 1 of John Brown. I got all of this information from the book John Brown, His Fight for Freedom, written by John Hendricks. The book is John Brown, His Fight for Freedom, written by John Hendricks. Let's continue. Okay, so Ohio was called a free state. This was because it did not allow slavery. Now, before the Civil War, many states allowed white men to own black people and treat them like they were property. Millions of black men, children, and women were enslaved without hope of ever becoming free. John Brown knew this was a terrible thing. It was an abomination. John's father, Owen, was also an abolitionist. Owen and John both ran stops on what would soon be known as the Underground Railroad. For those of you who do not know, the Underground Railroad was a collection of lines of safe houses that escaping slaves could stay in as they made their way up to free Canada. John helped smuggle enslaved people using furniture wagons, which got them one step closer to freedom. John Brown was a devout Christian, just like his father. John taught his family to love God with all of their hearts and to love their neighbors just as much, even if that neighbor was different from them. One Sunday, John Brown and his family went to church. They were taken up to their pew in the front because this was their normal seat. When John turned around to greet the preacher, he saw his black friend sitting in the back pew. This back pew was behind a wood stove, which made it hard to see the preacher. So John stood up, offered all of the black section the front pew, the best seats in the house, and after that, John and his family continued to the back to sit down. Now this angered the white church, and at the end of the service, they immediately kicked them out. This made John Brown furious. Behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. That was from Ecclesiastes 4:1 out of the Bible. Upon reading those very words, John made an oath to fight slavery until its very roots were destroyed. John began to form a plan of grand liberation. This plan would not only free one man at a time, but it would free thousands. I will raise a storm in this country that will not stay so long as there is a slave on its soil. That was a quote by John Brown, and by 1847, John's actions gathered some attention in the black community. Frederick Douglass, a former slave and fellow abolitionist, came to talk to John about his plans. John explained that he didn't want a war. His plan was actually based on economics, and here is that plan. He and his allies would free slaves using long spears, which were called spikes. take those freedmen in the Allegheny Mountains, which were in Pennsylvania, and the weak would head up into Canada, as the stronger ones would stay back and help free more slaves, join the army that John set up. Since the owners wouldn't be able to rely on their slaves since they were disappearing, the owners wouldn't be sure that they could make profit on crops or other goods. John hoped that the owners would have to raise prices due to the lost slaves and eventually making slavery too expensive. This would awaken the country to economic ruin and the truth of how bad slavery was. This plan impressed Frederick Douglass, but still, he was unsure that it would work.